It's finally happening. We're getting all of those new EVs that we've been promised for so many years. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because what's far more fascinating, all of these new EVs that we're seeing, they've come in the past 6 months. And that presents a rather unusual conundrum. How does all of this impact EVs that came out less than a year ago? An incredibly valid point, especially in light of the following question. What's it like to live with one of the better EVs on the market today? Now, a huge recap as we kick this whole thing off. You and I drove this thing, believe it or not, less than a year ago. That's how fast things are moving. And we learned in Phoenix, this was the second best EV on the market when you take into account money and driving dynamics and all that stuff. And it wasn't just our experiment. My fellow World Car Awards jury, we awarded this thing World Car of the Year, and that's second to the IONIQ 5, which took the same prize the year prior. Now, so recap, why is it so special? Well, this is a car. It's based on 800 volt architecture, 73.2 kilowatt hour battery. But what's different here, the car you and I drove in Phoenix was fancy. It was faster, had all sorts of stuff. This is the basic one, this is the SE, but most importantly, it's rear wheel drive, and this one's got the long range battery. So this one, rated by the US government, 361 miles of range. Now that we understand the mission at hand, if you find value in these episodes, a favor. Could you click subscribe, like, notifications, all that stuff, but most importantly, could you share these episodes? Why? Because the YouTube algorithm, a complete bitch. Now, before you and I get started today, a bit of a surprise. This not being the dual motor and the less fancy flavor, it's lighter weight, 4,222 pounds, or depending on express your weights and measures, 1,915 kilograms. How much lighter weight? That is about, actually a little bit over 400 pounds less than the car we drove in Arizona. With that, the acceleration here, not as good as the dual motor, but this, it feels lighter on its feet. You don't feel this is absolutely an EV. It's not slapping you across the face driving it around town. Like even in this neighborhood here, I feel the acceleration. What's most noticeable about the acceleration here, I have found, or at least gotten into this comfortable rhythm of using eco. It's more than enough in this. Now granted, 4,222 pounds is not a light vehicle, but something around town that is a heavy vehicle. These generally sedans are around 3,600 to 3,800 pounds, kind of like that car just passed here. But using it in town, it's probably the best use case of mid-size sedan EV that you and I have experienced over the past couple of years. You don't feel that weight slapping across the face, kind of like in a full-fat SEL or limited IONIQ 5, which has a tall center of gravity, and that one is over 4,600 pounds in weight. So this is a nice departure, especially when you're dealing with like speed bumps here. I'm going to go over this a bit faster, kind of get up this Prius's ass. And the car is both not disturbed because it is 4,200 pounds, but it just doesn't slap you in the face as this obese pig. Okay, so now let's you and I try what this thing really is meant for. Not just driving around town, but also on the freeway here. Let's get some acceleration going here. Again, eco mode, more than enough acceleration to get on this on-ramp. And here's one of the things you notice about that balance of that weight. It doesn't have quite the supple ride quality that the IONIQ 5 has. That one with the higher center of gravity and extra weight, that feels almost like a luxury car. I told you that car has a personality in many different episodes. Kind of like a Porsche Taycan has personality, but not that of a sports sedan, rather that of like a Lexus. This, not so much. This feels, I'd say, somewhere between a Lexus and, say, a Mercedes E-Class. And when I say E-Class, I mean E-Class gas car, not an EQE. Now, why do I say that? Because you feel that extra wheelbase. Remember, we talked about that in the first drive review. This has more wheelbase. It's a packaging trick that electric cars use, but in this case, you feel it behind you because it's more usable for the rear seat passengers. So it's almost like the steering is more responsive in this now longer vehicle, but then it has the feel of that E-Class, meaning a bigger vehicle. So it almost sits like a tweener, at least in driving dynamics around town, between a C-Class and an E-Class. And now we need to turn our discussion to money, because really this is the biggest change over the past couple of months with all these new EVs coming out. This is about a $45,000 car because it's the long range. If it was the most basic short range, it'd be about $37,000. If it was limited with 2 motors, it'd be about $52,000. But here's what's changed over the past couple of months. And all those previous supply chain issues during the virus that drove the price of these cars up because there weren't availability. Now there's availability, and it's a combination of things. The economy is starting to crater. You have new entrants in the market, and less people buying cars. As such, there's more incentives on these things. So Hyundai, just a glance at a main Hyundai site, it's about $2,500 incentive they've given on these cars. The fancy one they're still selling, it's only $1,000 incentive. What does that translate to what most people do with these things? You guys know I am not a fan of debt or leasing, but most people do lease these things. That has changed what these things cost. Now, most of these, at least the specials we're talking about, $5,000 down, and the cheapest one, I've seen about $230 a month. However, the one we're looking at here, I've seen this as low as $300 a month. But then you get into the fancy one that gets into $500, $600, $700 a month. Now, that brings about a big question. Compare this to what an ICE would cost, something similar kind of car. That would be a Camry. Base price of that, the most cheap seats Camry, is about $26,000. Most of them transact in the middle 30s. So the ones you see on the lease specials are that middle 30s car. And I'm seeing with $3,000 down, they can be as low as $300 to $350 a month. The hybrid, those are not as easy to come by, still difficult. So the incentive there is not so much leasing. They give you a 5% APR if you finance the car for 4 years. That brings us back to this. What if you were to buy the car or finance it? There, Hyundai gives you 3%. Now, putting aside my inner car salesman here, the market clearly is changing, and not just on these, everything, but these in particular, because what's happening, we're crossing the chasm. I'm getting into business books here. Great book if you haven't read it. That's when you move from the people that are the first mover advantage, the tech people that had to have these things when they first came out, to now mainstream buyers. And the mainstream buyer has more choice. A $35,000 Volvo or a $50,000 Hyundai. Granted, this is more car. Frankly, this drives better than that car. But this, it's more about price and, frankly, if people have a place to charge the vehicle. Here we've got a level 2 where we can charge it, so it works in my world, in my infrastructure. So this really isn't just about numbers. This is where we get back to the debate of the grid and the infrastructure. But the cars themselves, the good news here, the prices, they're definitely coming down. Let's see if you and I can take the Volt in eco mode. Oh, it's kind of rough, man. He's hitting it hard, but we got him. Look at that. An EV race. Well, sort of EV, a hybrid versus an EV race. That one's kind of beat up. It's a shame because those are great cars. Good used car values, but I digress. A couple of notes here. This, love the color. Digital green. It's like a dark forest green metallic, but this interior color, just awful. Now they do offer a nicer interior color, but unlike German manufacturers, that only happens with the more expensive car. In the cheaper car, which this is, it's not the cheapest, but in the cheaper cars, any color as long as you want black. The good news is it's got this cloth in here. I am one of those people not fussed at all by cloth, kind of like it in the right application. This has like a broad texture. It's almost like a broadcloth. I do like it a lot. It seems to be, it would last better than the leather or other choices. I would definitely want this even in the fancy one, just in a different color. Maybe if I'm really kind of getting greedy here, how about like a houndstooth, something that adds to the design details we talked about in the original episode. Then speaking of design details, remember we talked about this love that they borrowed this from old BMWs, like 5 Series, that kind of stuff back in the day, where they put the window switches literally where your hand falls. This is great. However, I found one problem. The door lock switch, why is that here? Think about it, you're outside of the car when you invariably have to let somebody in, then you have to reach in, unlock the door, and then reach back out. That would be better over here, and we can hide it so it doesn't disturb the nice design. And then while we have this land reclaim, the heated seat function, we talked about this in both the IONIQ 5 as well as the 6. It's like buried in here, so I gotta hit this to go to that, or I gotta go through the screen. Let's just put this over here. And while we're talking about things that should be changed, I hate the door handles with the force of 1,000 suns. Hopefully I've not been unclear. It's not just a Hyundai thing, it's all EVs and like plug-in hybrids. I see what they're going for. They're trying to get the fuel efficiency, basically lower the coefficient of drag, which this 0.22, can't fault them. They do that by hiding the door handles. But I gotta believe there is a way to make the car aerodynamic and have like a trade-off between the door handles that invariably, even in a Hyundai or a Toyota, will break. I promise you, after this car is 5 or 7 years, those will break. How about we do like they did in that new Santa Fe, where they have that handle so you can step up on the tire to reach the roof rack? That is not electronic. It's simply like a door. It's like a doggy door where you put your hand into the doggy door and you pull up. How about we do something like that and then like have a release button, almost like a C8 Corvette, something like that. That probably would be more reliable, and it wouldn't be as annoying, because think about the instances where you park, you run in, you get something, the door handles go back in, then the car doesn't recognize you fast enough that you've got the key fob in your pocket, then you gotta like bang on the door to get the door handle open, and you're wasting time. Again, not just Hyundais, it's all of them that do this. So let's go back to a basic door handle or something that's a hybrid between the two, and this way it's a combination of long-term reliability and just simplicity that will save real time when you're using the car on a daily basis. Thus far, you and I have discussed the good, the bad, now the ugly, and that is the reliability of these things. For the most part, they've held up quite well. However, there is one major issue that's turned into a class action lawsuit, and that is the charging on level 2. Believe it or not level 3. Level 3, I've been able to charge this thing as advertised, 10 to 80% in 18 minutes. However, level 2, according to the suit, it's just not charging fast enough. Hyundai says these things charge between 5 and 7 hours on level 2, which we're plugged in right now. However, most people are reporting 10 to 20 hours. My experience in trying to get over the 80%, I went over the 7 hours. So I charged it once to full, and it took me about 9.5 hours. There's also some issues in that class action lawsuit of the 12-volt battery dying prematurely. Maybe that has something to do with the charging and some overheating with the charging. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, this lawsuit is very fresh. It was only filed in July of 2023, so you and I will have to keep an eye on it, come back to this discussion. But in terms of reliability, and speaking to both IONIQ 6 as well as IONIQ 5 owners, these have proven to be very reliable, with exception of the stuff we talked about, as a Hyundai has been over the past 10 years. Then something rather unusual with this build. Yes, it's the basic model, not the complete basic model because it's got the long-range battery, but the equipment level is not what I expect. I expected nothing in this car. Obviously no leather, you see that. But it has like a power driver's seat over here. It's got heated seats in the front, but it's manual seat over there. Then the ADAS, it doesn't have all the ADAS the fancy one has, but it has some of the ADAS. Usually in like an ICE car, in the basic model like a Camry, it's got nothing. This, it's like an odd blend, and I'm guessing it's a combination of technologies that is just cheaper to put in all electric cars rather than taking them out for the basic car. And so we come to the moment of truth in 3 areas. Number 1, we first looked at this exercise. What's it like to live with an IONIQ 6? Then number 2, the range. And number 3, how does this compare against cars that came out only 3 to 6 months after it? That's how fast the market is changing. Let's look at the first point. What's it like to live with this car? It's fantastic. I would argue I like it better than the IONIQ 5 because it's not a crossover. It doesn't have that high center of gravity, and this just makes it a better usable vehicle around town, at least for a car guy like myself. Then we get into the range. U.S. government says this is 361 miles of range, one of the best ones out there. However, I depleted it, charged it all the way to full, and I got just under 400 miles of range, really without even trying and driving it like a New Yorker. Then number 3, how does this compare against newer cars that came out just recently, like that new Volvo, 35 grand. The reality is the Volvo, I don't think they'll be able to build enough of those simply because of price. But in terms of driving dynamics and usability, this is the better tool. In terms of unique design and some of the tactile feel, the Volvo is better. And that brings us to really the bigger point of this exercise, not so much just what it's like to live with this, but the pace of change of this segment. It is moving faster than the pace of change in internal combustion engine cars, where in a year from now, we'll look back on this and say, maybe not it's yesterday's garbage, but rather there's such a delta between this and this, rather between this and this. You get my point here. Then we get into something that I didn't expect when I was going to drive this car. I had the opportunity to drive the IONIQ 5N. It is unusually good. Like, you and I have driven fast electric cars and they're kind of disappointing, like the AMG EQE. That's just a lot of power, kind of like the EV6 GT, same thing, a lot of power but no dynamics. That is not at all the case with the IONIQ 5N, and there's a gimmick in there where they change gears even though it doesn't have a transmission. They blip the torque, and if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, they play around with the regen. So there's car control in a tall, heavy crossover. I am now more excited for an N version of this thing here, because you take all the dynamics that they put in that, put it in this, lower center of gravity and lower weight, going to be equal to, probably almost better because it's smaller than the Taycan 4S. And that in turn brings us to the wish list, and you can imagine what I'm going to say here. In the coming IONIQ 6N, yes, the driving dynamics of the 5, the power of the 5, but how about a little bit more lightweighting where we can get this thing down to, I know this is asking a lot, 3,600 pounds. Because what I didn't tell you in this episode, this EV here, that thing weighs only 3,600 pounds. That's why it has a 64 kilowatt hour battery, yet the range is similar, not the same, similar to this one with a 73 kilowatt hour battery. So lighter weight, but I'm just one man, and this is the point of the episode. I turn around to you guys to opine in the comments below or via our social media, MotoManTV onward, MotoManTV onward, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, if you got value out of this episode, I would highly suggest you watch one of our other Living With episodes of a car. Now granted, it was a performance car, but the BMW M2. There we not only learned what it's like to live with our car in South Florida, but we learned a lot about the cost of maintenance of that performance car. You can see that episode here. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.